Hey folks, a little confusion on the paperwork, but Howard and Terry are making sure you're all set. So we have Solomon builds the temple as one sheet. That's the one we started last week. And then we have Solomon builds the palace complex, which also has a lot of details about the area outside the temple. It's good to have you here. Each week you come down here and something's a little different in the basement. What did you notice today is maybe the newer floor. The vinyl plank flooring out there and some newer carpet that was as you came down the stairs. But then you see something that's not so new. The chairs you are sitting in. So the mauve chairs got put up on Facebook Marketplace for free after we found that Family of God didn't need them. And within 8 minutes, a bingo hall claimed them. And they got picked up and gone. And so then these brown and yellow chairs are from another generation ago. We washed them up and got them down here. The new chairs were supposed to have arrived on Friday, but they did not get here. Something else you might have noticed that was new as you arrived was I call them the parade barriers that are, if you're walking into the narthex to your right, and that is because they were doing some waterproofing in the elevator shaft this week. So they had those out there to protect their construction from, I guess, something else, whatever else wanted to walk by. So hopefully our elevator shaft is now dry. I don't know. What do you think, Howard? Is it going to be dry?
Certainly, that's the goal.
That's the goal. So we're getting closer to being done. So the floor out there is up. The base molding needs to go up and carpet in here. And then I think the last thing to go up will be the audio visual. And so we're on our way. From last week, we are on page 14, question 4. We're going to look at some of the details and describe how the 5 senses were included in the building of the temple. So this is in Luke chapter, I'm preaching on Luke. 1 Kings chapter 6. That's where I'm opening my Bible now, is 1 Kings. I'm glad everybody is here and found their way.
I was up in the sanctuary. Oh, thank you.
All right, so 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 15 is where we'll be starting today. But we'll start our time in the Word of God with prayer. Lord of hosts, forgive our sins, enable us to serve you and work with our neighbors, and to always see how your Word is a time of enrichment to charge our faith. In the name of Jesus, amen. So Luke chapter 6, verse 15, what I want you to do is, as we read these verses, to think about what you would see. So he lined the walls of the house on the inside with boards of cedar. From the floor of the house to the walls of the ceiling, he covered them on the inside with wood. And he covered the floor of the house with boards of cypress. So we've got the wainscot of the temple, which I used to always think was wainscoting, but it's wainscot. So you got the walls and the floors. What are they made of? Cedar. Now, have any of you have a cedar closet at home? Yeah. Cedar closets really have a fragrant smell. Yeah.
I have an old cedar chest, but it doesn't smell like cedar anymore. I mean, it's more than 50 years old, I'm sure,
You can refresh it with a little oil. What would be the best oil, Bill, to refresh it? I'm thinking.
I have a cedar chest. It was 1937 and it still smells like cedar.
Really?
Have you treated it at all?
No.
I've had a refresh one and I went to the hardware store and said, this is what I gotta do. Guys in Trevorrow knew what it was and it's worked, no problem.
Trevorrow worked, all right. My house, previous resident of the upstairs bedroom had been a smoker in the cedar closet. During the summer, humid days would just leach out that smell. So I went online and found this vinegar and some other things in there, wash, and we washed it. And so then on the humid days, it smelled like Easter for a while. because we thought we were dying eggs or something.
Yeah.
But now it just smells like a cedar closet. All right, let's look at verse 18 now. And so the cedar within the house was carved in the form of gourds and open flowers. All was cedar, no stone was seen. So what would the carvings, now this isn't going to be a smell part, because we're focusing more on the carving. What would you see? So what's that?
Well, it's like, decorations, wooden carvings of flowers and, what do they say, gourds.
Gourds,
Yeah, natural things.
natural things. And what's the detail we have about the flowers?
Open flowers.
Open flowers. It's always kind of interesting when adjectives are added to terms, and you're like, what does that add? Why do you think it's noteworthy that they're open?
Fragrance.
Right?
Yeah, the idea is that even though it's a carving, you're supposed to see that it's a place in bloom, that it's the right season. Flowers open up when there's sunshine on them. Flowers open up when it's the right season, and there they are, they're open. All right, let's now look at verse 19. So we're in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 19. The inner sanctuary he prepared in the innermost part of the house to set there the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Now for here, I want you to use your sight and get a sense of spatial awareness. What are some terms that are used in verse 19 to give you a sense of distance?
Innermost.
So you've got the inner sanctuary and the innermost part of the house. Now if you're standing at somewhat of a front, the Cardiff Bibles, where are they? Oh, just outside that door? Okay. So you've got this sense of a longer room, and you're now being directed to a space that's inner. And those words of description are meant to give your eyes a focus of something that's in a distance from you. All right, now we're going to read about the cherubim in verses 23 and 29. In the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. 5 cubits was the length of one wing of the cherub, 5 cubits the length of the other wing of the cherub. It was 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. And the other cherub also measured 10 cubits. Both cherub had the same measure and the same form. The height of one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was that of the other cherub. He put the cherubim in the innermost part of the house, and the wings of the cherubim were spread out so that a wing of one touched the one wall, and a wing of the other cherub touched the other wall, and their other wings touched each other in the middle of the house. And he overlaid the cherubim with gold. Round all the walls of the house he carved engraved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers in the inner and outer rooms. And so the imagery here of the cherubims is that they're set down on either side of the Ark of the Covenant, and they have one wing that goes to the wall and one wing that meets their friend. And so then the wings are over the Ark of the Covenant. So if you see the Ark of the Covenant and you look up, you would see the wings of the cherub meeting. What does the writer of Kings want to emphasize about the 2 cherubs, besides how their wings meet the walls and meet each other? Anything else that you see as important details that are added about the cherubim?
Overlaid with gold.
They're overlaid with gold, so they'd have this just glimmer about them.
Right, when you saw the sun hit them.
The sun probably wouldn't hit them because they're in the innermost part, and so they're deep in there. But there'd be candles, and the candles would light off of them.
In fact, most people would never see these.
Most people would never see them.
So
That's
when they
right.
got the ark in there, the high priest would see them, and that should be about it.
So the high priest would enter on the Day of Atonement, and there he would see them. But otherwise, there's this magnificent artistry that others are never going to see because the curtain of the temple is going to veil the view of them.
Who dusted them?
The altar circle.
And then, but the people would still see cherubim, because you'll see in verse 29, around the walls of the house he carved engraved figures of the cherubim. So people around the walls would see smaller versions of that which is on the inside. All right, now we're going to look at the doors. And for the entrance of the inner sanctuary, he made doors of olive wood. The lintel and the doorposts were 5-sided. And he covered the doors of the olive wood with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. And he overlaid them with gold and spread gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. So that he made for the entrance to the nave doorposts of olive wood in the form of a square, and the 2 doors of cypress wood. The 2 leaves of the door were folding, and the 2 leaves of the other door were folding. On them he carved cherubim and palm trees and open flowers, and he overlaid them with gold evenly applied in the carved work. And he built the inner court with 3 courses of cut stone and 1 course of cedar beams. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv, and in the 11th year. Well, I got past where I wanted to read about the doors. Okay. So 31 to 35 had the doors. What do we see about the doors? So we think of a curtain, right? But right here, it's being described as olive wood doors. The curtain's going to come later for us. Right now, we've got this focus of these doors, and they're bifold doors, so that when they open, they don't swing big and out, but they collapse and then they move aside. What's on the doors? Cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. So there's the strong emphasis on that.
It also says gold, too.
And gold.
Yeah.
So my vicarage congregation was on Long Island at Trinity Hicksville, and they had these doors that were they were probably 20 feet tall and maybe 10 feet across, and they had each had 5 panels on them, and they were cast in bronze, and they were formed from these molds of this famous doors of the Lorenzo Gabretti Baptistry in Italy. And that during World War II, these doors were taken down and placed in a tunnel, and then there was this whole crew of artists and archaeologists that the U.S. Army sent after the war to try to recover the artifacts. George Clooney made a movie about this group. So it's not Ocean's 11. But so the Army found these doors, and they had been protected, and he had such an interest in these doors, one of the men of this team, that he took a wax casting of the doors, and then all of this is kind of not under any sort of supervision of someone important. But then he takes that wax molding back to the U.S., has the doors molded into bronze from this casting he had made, and then brought them to his church because he thought, where else would they be? And so Trinity then created a whole new narthex for these doors. These doors are just, each of them weigh tons because they're all cast out of bronze. And yet they're so balanced on these pins that you can open them with one finger. It was such a fun experience to be at that church and see the doors and open them. And then regularly, people from NYU would take field trips out to look at the doors because they were actually better shaped than the ones that were in Italy. But so these are doors that are covered in gold, made out of wood with cherubim and palm trees and gold. Yes, Meg.
I was just going to say, I don't know if anybody else needed a visual like I did after talking about this a little bit last week, but there are YouTube videos that give 3D renderings of Solomon's temple, and it is, the only word is awesome.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's their best guess, but it's worth There's a couple that are like 3 minutes long, there's one that's 10 minutes long, but it's worth checking out if you really want to see, I don't know what 20 cubits looks like with cherubims.
One of the things that's so important for me when reading this is that many movies that will show the temple is just like this very plain stone. And that's not the imagery at all of this. There's all these carvings and they're all covered in gold and the cherubim and the palm trees and the open flowers. It is something very magnificent. And it's also a reminder, if you go to Germany and you look in many Lutheran churches, they'll look incredibly plain because there was this iconoclastic controversy after the Reformation. And a lot of the artwork and stained glass and paintings and color on the stone was all destroyed. Or even like, have any of you been to the University of Chicago Mesopotamian Museum? I mean, it is a highlight if you go to Chicago. But beginning of the 20th century, a number of archaeologists went to Iraq and they took Persian artifacts. And so they've got these just gigantic doorways into like Persian temples that are now at the University of Chicago. But they're all stone, but they'll show you what it would have looked like because they would have been all painted with a flourish of color. Sometimes when we look at archaeology or at like the Parthenon in Greece and you think you look at the Areopagus and you look at all these magnificent monuments and they're just plain stone now and you think, oh, that's not the way it was supposed to be. They were all covered in color. All right, so we have one more thing. We're just looking at the 5 senses and how they look. So 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 36 says, he built the inner court with 3 courses of cut stone and 1 course of cedar beams. And so for the walls of the open air court, this would have been just right outside the roofed buildings. Wood was there only in part. It was also used there in stone. So the spot that would have been that open air is measured in stone. All right, so this sets aside. So those of you who arrived late, we've got 2 different sheets of paper rolling around here. One called Solomon Builds the Temple. This was the sheet of paper we used last week. We're done with that one just now. We just finished it. So now we have one that says Solomon Builds a Palace Complex. So we're looking at 1 Kings chapter 7. It says on the top, Solomon builds a complex. Are there any loose ones hanging around? So May's got some. If you don't have one, May will help you get one. And this one we probably won't finish either today. So when you're done, so 1 Kings chapter 7 is going to look at kind of the wider complex. Again, there's a lot of just visualness that comes. And we don't know the purpose of all of these buildings as they're built. So that's 1 through 12. And then 7, 13, and forward is more about the furnishings that are in the temple and like the great sea and things like that. And so chapter 7 starts, Solomon was building his own house 13 years and he finished his entire house. So the temple's going to be summarized a little bit later on as taking 7 years, and his building of his own house took 13 years. So we're going to kind of look at some of the descriptions of the hall of this, the hall of that, and I have to tell you that people still don't quite know how these functioned. We got some guesses though. So the first one we're going to look at is the house of the forest of Lebanon. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits and its breadth 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits, and it was built on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars, and it was covered with cedar above the chambers that were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. There were window frames in 3 rows and window opposite window in 3 tiers, and all the doorways and windows had square frames, and windows were opposite window in 3 tiers. So the first floor of cedar pillars likely gave the structure its name. All of the cedar would have been filled with a scent. How was this house used? All right, so this is one of the few that we might have a sense of how it was used. So we're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 17, and see if we learn anything about how the house of the forest of Lebanon was used. So 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 17. So this is a description of the wealth that Solomon has. And it says, he made 300 shields of beaten gold. 3 minas of gold went into each shield. And the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. All right, so from this simple phrase, what do we learn about the house of the forest of Lebanon?
Military.
I don't know if you would use 300 shields in a military enterprise, though, of gold. I don't think you would use gold shields as actual military enterprise.
Just purely decorative.
Purely decorative, but also kind of a holding of his wealth. All right, let's look at verse 21. And all of King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. Silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. You'll notice that there's drinking vessels for the forest of Lebanon. So there are these vessels that are purely for use in the forest of Lebanon. So I start to get the sense that this is a drinking hall. Where, what's that?
Like a great gathering.
Like a great gathering hall that is surrounded with shields of gold. So as Solomon's officers would gather, there was specific drinking vessels for the forest of Lebanon.
Or you look at it as a place for state dinners.
For state dinners.
You're showing off, hey, look, I can put 300 shields of gold on the wall. How much do you think I got in the vault?
There you go. And then we're going to now look at Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 22, verse 8.
Isaiah 22.
Yeah, Isaiah 22. And this is going to be, this is where Isaiah is describing the exodus that God is going to be bringing about of Jerusalem. That Jerusalem is not going to be forever, in the time of Israel, a place of security. So Isaiah is giving people a prophecy that Isaiah is not always the refuge you think it will be. And so we're going to see how Isaiah describes things falling apart with some reference to the house of the forest of Lebanon. So it says in Isaiah 22:8, he has taken away the covering of Judah. And that day you looked to the weapons of the house of the forest, and you saw that the breaches of the city of David were many. And you collected the waters of the lower pool, and you counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you broke down the houses to fortify the wall. So the covering of Judah, the idea that Judah's got strong walls, is falling apart. And it says, you looked to the weapons of the house of the forest. So that is not normally where you would look for weapons, because they weren't effective weapons. They were just weapons of gold. But things are getting to the spot that they even now are looking to the decorative weapons, the pretend weapons to try to protect themselves. And then it says, then you looked to the waters and you emptied the waters because they get thirsty during a siege. And then it says, and then you looked to the houses and you destroyed all the houses to fortify yourself. So this is a description of how things are falling apart. When Isaiah describes things that are falling apart, this is where you can kind of say, why is it important description of how things are falling apart that they looked to the weapons of the houses of the forest of Lebanon? Well, the people would know that those were just pretend weapons. And that tells you how bad it is when people are going to battle with decorative weapons rather than real weapons. But if you didn't know 1 Kings 7, or you hadn't walked through the house of the forest of Lebanon a lot, this reference to Isaiah 22:8 might be, oh, they're looking for more weapons and they got some in the house. And you're like, great. And then you go, wait, that's not what he means. So this is kind of one of those spots where some cross-referencing gives you some sense. All right, so we looked at the house of the forest of Lebanon. Then we've got another house, and he made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits and its breadth 30 cubits. And there was a porch in front of the pillars and a canopy in front of them. Its use is unknown. I don't have anywhere else to tell you where to go to learn how this was used. Some think that as they construct the orientation of the buildings, that maybe it was an entrance that you would walk through to get to the rest of the complex. Don't know. That happens sometimes. We don't know. Verse 7. He made the hall of the throne where he was to pronounce judgment, even the hall of judgment. And it was finished with cedar from floor to rafters. So this room, we have a little bit better sense of what it was used for, right? What was the throne hall used for? For some coronation, but also the law. This is where when he sat on the throne, he pronounced judgment. If there was a dispute and he's sitting on the throne, he speaks with authority. Then verse 8, his own house where he was to dwell in the outer court, back of the hall, was of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. So verse 8 describes his house was in the back of the hall. So behind the throne hall was his house. So he could enter the throne room from his own house and not have to walk through everybody else. I suppose in a way it's kind of like how the White House and the West Wing are connected. Although I think you have to walk outside.
Well, what you've got here is the courtroom where the judge comes into the front, not through the audience.
There you go, yeah. So in a courtroom, the judge doesn't arrive in a procession through the people, but he arrives from his spaces behind. Let's look at verse 9 now. All these were made of costly stones, cut according to measure, sawed with stones, back and front, even from the foundation to the coping, from the outside to the great court. This phrase, costly stones, is noteworthy because when it comes later in this chapter to building the temple furnishings, it's going to mention that Solomon did not take notice of how much it cost. And so costly stones here seems like he's extravagant with his building of his own palace. But you contrast with the phrasing of the cost of the temple furnishings, and you realize he knew the cost of his stones. He wrote a blank check for the cost of the stones for the temple furnishing. So the costly stones mentioned there is not just to say, wow, he used really expensive stones to build his palace. But it becomes even more noteworthy when you realize it says it was built without measure of cost when he's talking about the temple furnishings. All right. The foundation for the courtyard was built with 2 layers of stone. And the foundation, costly stones, huge stones, stones of 8 and 10 cubits. And above these were costly stones cut according to measurement in cedar. The great court had 3 courses of cut stone all around and a course of cedar beams. So at the inner court of the house of the Lord, the vestibule of the house. So there's lots of things there. All right, tremendous skill required for building of the palace complex. Chapter 6, verse 38 finishes by saying, in the 11th year in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all of its parts according to all of its specifications. He was 7 years in building it. Solomon was building his own house. It was 13 years, and he finished the entire house. So some reading this have wondered, is this a jab by the writer? That Solomon spends 7 years on the temple, but 13 years on his own palace. Maybe. But it is not there besides the reference in time. Because everything that he does with the temple, he does according to God's plans. There's not any description where God told him to build this and he built it with poplar instead of oak. You know, there's no reference to any sort of slight that he made in building the temple. It just took 7 years. That's all it is. Yes, Barb.
Was it also because of the contract he made with the people in Lebanon, that they also came and helped work at building the temple?
Yeah.
So the workforce might have been there in force to build the temple.
That's a good point. Then we also have another one, a numerologist kind of reading of it, is 7 years is the days of creation with the day of rest. But the palace is 1 day less than 14. 1 year less than 14, so it's not quite a fullness of multiple sides. Sometimes numerologists like to see that sort of stuff. All right, we're going to now look at 1 Kings 7:13 to 14. King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre, and he was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. He was full of wisdom, understanding, and skill for making any work in bronze. He came to King Solomon and did all of his work. This is seen by people as not as the same man who was the king of Lebanon, named Hiram. This one is a widow of the tribe of Naphtali. So he's a part of that bridge between the two nations there. So Exodus 31, where the tabernacle is being built, also makes specific mention of Bezalel, who was the artist for building the tabernacle. So you have in Exodus and now in 1 Kings the naming of kind of the artisan of the tabernacle and the temple. That they're just not nameless workers. The artist gets referenced. What does that tell us about how God works?
I think he's specific. He's not a God of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
He knows. He pays attention to details.
He pays attention to detail that there are moments when there is someone specific that God's going to use. Now,
This gets back to our teaching of the professions. God honors work and grants skills to do them.
mm-hmm.
And said specifically in Exodus here, it's again, the guy has been gifted to do this stuff, and he uses his gift for the glory of God. And we get back to all work, all honorable work is important to God.
Yeah, so there are skilled laborers that get named, that God doesn't just use people who are generic. He has specific people for specific purposes. And as he builds up his promises, your name might be used for something specific that you are gifted for. And if people remember your name, that's not a thing of pride as much as, like arrogant pride, as much as it is okay to remember someone's name and say, this guy did that. It's pretty amazing that this guy has that skill and he did it. Think about great architects. Howard, what's the architect that's connected with this building? Seraphim, right? That's not a generic name. We know that name through the St. Louis Arch and work at Cranbrook and the seminary at Fort Wayne. It's not from the same firm. So names do get known, and it's okay to remember some names. Yeah, Jim.
Carrying over your sermon about the importance of time, I think that plays into this too, because these men were mature and they were experienced in their craft, but most important, they were available right at the time that God needed them.
God had prepared the moment of time for this, yeah.
So it was the opportune time for both of these people, not by sheer coincidence, to be available. So once again, the importance of time.
God has the measure of the time, yeah. And so the consecration bulletin, commissioning, I'm not sure exactly what you call it. The bulletin for when this building was built has all the liturgy, the hymns in it, but then it has a listing of all of the contractors. And so that you can still go back and you can find it. It's kind of beige colored, and on there, all of these contractors are still listed. To say that these names aren't to be forgotten, just as you would remember who the pastor was, or the chair of the building committee, you remember the workers. All right, let's look now at 1 Kings 7, 15 through 22. And we're going to see here a lot of technical phrases. I have a commentary that I was reading about this by Walter A. Meyer III, and he has, in each section, they'll have his translation of the Hebrew, and then he'll have notes for why he translated the words that he did. 15 through 22 had 8 pages of translation notes, which is unusual. Most sections, it might be half a page. And he writes in introduction to all of his notes about why he translated words this way. It says, this section has some of the highest concentration of architectural terms and phrases, of unique Hebrew words. And so we'll look at it now, though. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured its circumference. It was hollow, and its thickness was 4 fingers. So that's how thick the bronze was that shaped that pillar. The second pillar was the same. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze. So the capital is that top of the pillar of cast bronze to set on top of the pillars. And the height of one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. There were lattices of checker work with wreaths of chain work for the capitals on top of the pillars, a lattice for the one capital and a lattice for the other capital. Likewise, he made pomegranates in 2 rows around the one lattice work to cover the capital that was on top of the pillar, and he did the same with the other capital. Now the capitals were on top of the pillars, and the vestibule were of lily work 4 cubits. And the capitals were on the 2 pillars and also above the rounded projection which was beside the lattice work. There were 200 pomegranates in 2 rows all around, so with the other capital. He set up the pillars at the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the south and called its name Yakin, and he set up the other pillar on the north and called its name Boaz, and on top of the pillars was lily work. Thus was the work of the pillars was finished. All right, some notes about these pillars is that they were not engineered to hold up the building. They were built after the building was built. And so they are there for this expanse of presentation. I mean, just think of the circumference of them. A cubit is, this, so 12 cubits. I mean, these are big, wide pillars with very ornate capitals. And there's so Walter Meyer's description of how the capitals, there's a word that he uses that he translates as receptacle. That the capitals are built almost as not just these things that are to hold up the temple porch, but are almost like they look like a basket. That lattice work, they're meant to be this thing that also holds things. All right, so now this gets to the names of these 2 things. So we're going to look at the names of them. So the name Yakin, you've got it there. Translated in the ESV, it's a J-A-C-H-I-N, or a Y. That J sound is not very much a Hebrew sound, so think of it as a Y sound, Yakin. Translation of that is kind of he establishes, or he founds. And then the other one, Boaz, is a word that means maybe in him is strength. And so the pillars are serving not an architectural engineering principle, but as a theological representation to show everyone what's on the inside. People knew the names of these pillars. And so you would see one and say, God establishes. You'd see the other one and go, and in God is strength. And that these now become theological teaching tools for what is happening in the temple. That God is establishing something here at this temple, and this temple is a place where you can be a witness to his strength. So I want you to now think about, if you knew that these temples are these named things, fill in the blank. He establishes, what's in that blank? What does he establish at this temple? What is this temple establishing? Yeah, Howard. Reverence, and so there's just this great sense of this is something different. This isn't just your falafel stand. I mean, there's something here. All right, so there's some reverence. What else is God establishing here?
His presence.
His presence. That Solomon had set out to build the temple as a place to honor the name of the Lord. So the name of God is to be here and remembered. All right, now let's think about strength. What strength do you have in God? When you see this temple and you see all the cubits of stuff, what is strong about this place? There's strong foundation. The courses and courses of stone, the many pillars, the vision of the cherub and the palm trees and the flowers. There's the strength of not just cold strength of just stone, but there's the warmth of the wood, there's the jewel of the gold, and then there's the imagery of the abundance of the land. This is not a cold stone monument. It's a place that's meant to show the vibrancy of the land, that the strength of the Lord is in the land. Everything that is artistic is meant to show the product of the land that they are in. It's not just that this is a place, but the place is representation of everything that's in the land as well, with the imagery of the cherubim, which are meant to be always flying around, no, it's a seraphim. Cherubim, where do we know the cherubim? This gets that connection to the cherubim. Where else are cherubim mentioned in the scriptures? Terry?
Isaiah 6.
That is the seraphim. This is where I almost fumbled.
Do they guard the garden?
They guard the garden. Yeah. They guard the entrance to the garden with a double-edged flaming sword. Genesis 3 describes there as Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. So cherubim are at the entrance to the Garden of Eden, entrance into the paradise. And now you see here the cherubim are at the temple. So there is this representation of this abundance of the fruit of the land there.
Pastor, what's the difference between, I don't say.
The cherubim and the seraphim, what's the difference? So the seraphim are described also as winged creatures, but they have multi-headed faces, and they are the ones that sing the holy, holy, holy. And the seraphim are the ones that took the tongs of coal and touched Isaiah's lips. The seraphim are described as always flying around the throne of God. And the cherubim are described as guarding the way to paradise. And so we have a different function between the two. The seraphim are always giving praises to God, and the cherubim are always guarding the way to paradise. In kind of Renaissance, our cherubs then become known as these little chunky baby flowery things. But in the scriptures, the cherubim are the ones that have the sword. The seraphim have the song, and the cherubim have the sword. 1 Kings 7:23-26 is where the reference to the sea is. And so we are looking outside of the temple. So we are outside now as we're moving from the pillars further outside now. So dimensionally, you are at the doors of the temple. Behind you is the temple. In front of you is the pillar. You take a step past the pillar, and now you've got this sea. It says he made the sea of cast metal. It was round, 10 cubits from brim to brim, and 5 cubits high, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Under its brim were gourds for 10 cubits compassing the sea all around. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with it when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set on them, and all their rear parts were inward. Its thickness was a handbreadth, and its brim was made like the brim of a cup, like the flower of a lily. It held 2,000 baths. So the bronze sea made by Hiram, it is a tremendous thing of skill and craftsmanship. It was about 3 inches thick, 15 feet wide, 7.5 feet tall. There's some debate on whether it was cylindrical, meaning that its walls went straight down, or was it a hemisphere and its walls came in like this. It's been drawn both ways. It could be both. One person conjectured if it was a hemisphere, it would have been tough to stay balanced on the oxen. A good wind, it might have wanted to go or something like that. But if it was straight walls down, and then those sat on the backs of the oxen, then maybe that's what it was. So as you picture it, and then the lip has just a little flange outward. And it was cast in bronze, so you've got this huge cylinder cast in bronze, about 3 inches thick, with this tremendous diameter. And this is where it gets, sometimes people read in the Bible a lot. And so you can see its description, which is really close to its description of pie. And there was a group of Christians that refused to see pi as 3.14 and all the digits, but said it was this. And they gave this as the formula for pi for a while. And kind of like, I don't think that was the intention of 1 Kings 7 to give the formula for pi, as much as to describe the cylinder. But the fact that it is as close to pi as it is shows you that it isn't an oval. It is very tightly a circle in a pretty amazing direction. All right, what was the sea for? We don't know exactly, but there's some conjecture that it was made large enough for priests to do ritual bathing in, and that there would be a set of stairs that would go on the outside, and then another stairs that would go on the inside, and priests could go in there. But there's also mention a little bit after this of, in verse 27, 10 stands of bronze. So there were 10 basins of bronze that were used, 5 and 5 were their direction, and they were used for washing the animals before they were offered. And they were on carts that could wheel, and the direction is that these stands would hold water that would get filled by the sea. And so this great, this sea, as it was called, could be not a place for ritual bathing, but just for filling up these basins. Or it could be both. So Walter Meyer, as he's writing the commentary, he sees this visually as a reminder of baptism. As you enter into the temple, the priest would first bathe in the sea. The sea is large enough for more than one priest to enter in at a time, and then they would exit out of it, and then they would do their priestly duties. There is some possible reference to this sea being a place of bathing in Isaiah and Ezekiel. So we're going to now look at Isaiah 4. I do think it's interesting that something as big and as dramatic as this, we still don't have a lot of clear description of how it was used. And there's still people that write, it could be this, it could be that. So Isaiah 4:4, it says, "When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning." So you've got this description of the Lord on that day washing people. So not as tight reference to the sea, but we do see this imagery of washing. That God is going to wash the people. So maybe that's an imagery that people would have ready catch to hold on to because they see it as the priest wash. Let's look at Ezekiel 36. So Ezekiel 36, 25 through 27. So this is right before the Valley of Dry Bones, where Ezekiel is being told by God. God is telling Ezekiel, I'm going to work through you. As much as Jerusalem has fallen apart, I'm going to preserve a remnant, and you're going to be a part of that remnant, and you're going to lead the people. So this is how God is preparing Ezekiel for this prophetic task of calling to the dry bones and all the tasks of renewal that God is giving to Ezekiel. So verses 25 through 27 says this, "I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all of your uncleanness, and from all your idols I will cleanse you, and I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh, and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and be careful to obey my rules." Again, not a super clear reference to the sea, but there is this imagery of water washing. That there's this pattern of God wanting to wash the people. All right, we're going to look at one more spot, and this is Zechariah. A good way to find Zechariah, you know, those 12 minor prophets always kind of spin in a mix of soup for me, is I find Matthew, then there's Malachi, and then there's Zechariah. So there's two minor prophets, Zephaniah and Zechariah. The two hard sounds are right next to each other, Malachi and Zechariah. So I always remember Malachi and Zechariah are right next to each other because they're two hard cut sounds. And Zephaniah is a little bit further away from them because he's got a softer middle sound. You know, you got to come up with some way to remember where these books are.
Clear as alphabet soup.
Clear as alphabet soup. All right. So Zechariah 13:1 says, "On that day there shall be a fountain opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and uncleanness." So there's this imagery, this foreshadowing of this washing of entrance that's there throughout everything. I agree. I didn't give you a great reference to this is what the sea was used for or anything like that.
Weren't there a lot of rules about cleansing then, though?
Yes. So another one to look at, I didn't write down here, but is Leviticus chapter 8, verse 5 through 9. And this describes how Aaron and his sons will get ready for working in the tabernacle. So the tabernacle is the precursor to the temple. And so before Aaron and his sons are going to work inside the tabernacle, Moses says you've got some work to do to get clean. So this is maybe the best way to understand that the Great Sea was used for the priests to get clean. So Leviticus chapter 8 verse 5 says, "And Moses said to the congregation, 'This is the thing that the Lord has commanded to be done.' And Moses brought Aaron and his sons and washed them with water. And he put the coat on him and tied the sash around his waist and clothed him with the robe and put the ephod in him and tied the skillfully woven band of the ephod around him, binding it to him with the band. He placed the breastpiece on him, and on the breastpiece he put the Urim and the Thummim. He set the turban on his head, and on the turban in front he set the golden plate, the holy crown, as the Lord had commanded Moses." So before the priest gets dressed and everything, he has to wash. And so whenever the priest would go into duty, he would always wash before he put this clothing on. And so this is probably the best reference we have for the purpose of the Great Sea. Can we finish the Great Sea? I think we can. All right, so besides artistic decorations, what do you think were the possible meanings for the gourds encircling the sea in 2 rows? So right below the lip of the top of the Great Sea are 2 rows of gourds encircling it. And it makes a great deal of point of saying they were cast together with the Great Sea. All right, so it's cute. It's beautiful, right? Besides being beautiful, what else could this is where, like, what did the artist mean? I don't have it for you, but maybe, this is where we all go down to the DIA and we look together at a painting and we wonder, what did the artist think of this? What's the point of the 2 gourds there? 2 rows of gourds.
To give life.
To give life, and yeah. And what a gourd, what is a gourd? For those of you who have been wondering, what is a gourd?
Squash, isn't it?
Like a squash, yeah. Filled with lots of seeds. At the harvest, you can enjoy the gourd, but there's always this plentiful seed for things. So if like a pumpkin is a gourd, right? And there's a lot of seeds inside of a pumpkin.
Also, gourds become ancient canteens. That a way you would take the purity with you, you would put water in the gourd.
Right, there you go. So you dry a gourd, and you have a little cut opening out of it, and you can see this. And if you do go to the DIA into the African exhibit, there are lots of dry gourds there. So there you go. It could be a reminder that the water that's in this Great Sea is to be carried. Maybe it's gourds not as harvest plentiful, but gourds as carrying. There you go. See, again, it's not in here, so we get to say this stuff. As the temple is a symbol of the kingdom of God, both heaven here on earth and in heaven, the house of God is reminiscent of the first sanctuary, the Garden of Eden. The character of the sea and the basin with the description of Eden. So Genesis 2:6. What does that say that might give us a way to understand why this Great Sea is at the entrance to the temple? Someone find Genesis 2:6 and read it.
And a mist was going up from the land and was watering the whole face of the ground.
Yeah, so there's this, the Garden of Eden is described as filled with this mist that is watering the ground, that there's just this great sense of water at the Garden of Eden. And then in Revelation, as the new heaven and new earth are described, it describes that there's a river that runs through the city of God whose streams make glad the people, and that there is on the shores of the stream trees that bear fruit every month. Water is important in the Garden of Eden. Water is important in the description of Revelation of the new heaven and new earth. It makes sense that as you walk up to the temple, you see a lot of water.
Isn't water the source of life?
Right, so we've got this idea of water being this great expanse in Genesis 1, 1 through 3. In the beginning, when God's created the heavens and the earth, there was this water, and the Spirit hovered over the waters. And everything that's made is coming from this chaos of waters there, and God forms those waters into purpose. The sea rested on 12 oxen. Interestingly, the oxen were replaced by King Ahaz in 2 Kings 16-17. So if you just want to go, sometimes people do renovate. So in 2 Kings verse 16, we get a description of what happens there. And King Ahaz himself wasn't a great good king, but in verse 17 it says, "And King Ahaz cut off the frames of the stands and removed the basin from them. He took down the sea from off the bronze oxen that were under it and put it on a stone pedestal. And the covered way for the Sabbath that had been built inside the house, an outer entrance for the king, he caused to go around the house of the Lord because of the king of Assyria." He changed the look of the temple to satisfy some demands of the king of Assyria. So the 12 oxen weren't removed because there was this worry of syncretism that people were starting to worship a golden calf. No, not at all. King Ahaz just thought, well, King of Syria wants some stone there. I'll get rid of the bronze. All right, that's where we're finishing. It's about 10:45. We got some Palm Sunday procession that's going to be happening. We got some choirs there singing. We got some loud hosannas that are going to be shouted by kids. Let's close with prayer. Deliver us, O Lord, from wicked leaders like King Ahaz, who would corrupt or impede and change what we do as God's people to satisfy the comforts of others. In the name of Jesus, amen. Keep your sheet, and we'll finish it up tomorrow as we begin, not tomorrow, not next Sunday, but the Sunday after. There will be no Bible study on Easter.